Hello, and welcome to the Logistics Management Podcast Series. My name is Jeff Berman. I'm Group News Editor for Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group. Today, it's a real pleasure to welcome Marc Iampieri to our podcast. Marc serves as Global Co-Leader of the Logistics and Transportation Practice and also as Partner and Managing Director for New York-based AlixPartners, a global business consulting firm. Marc applies 25 years of experience to help companies resolve complex supply chain and distribution challenges. He is currently the North American leader for their shipping, logistics, and infrastructure industry practice, while also co-leading the global operations practice focused on supply chain management. Through much of his career, Marc is focused on improving the supply chain performance of manufacturing and distribution intensive companies. And he also focuses on the operational improvement of fleet operators and logistics services providers. Based on this experience, Marc frequently advises clients in the consumer goods, retail, energy, and industry verticals regarding their logistics strategy and operations. Marc also is a frequent guest speaker at industry conferences addressing various topics of transportation and logistics, and is the co-author of Alix's annual home delivery and final mile logistics report, as well as its annual container shipping outlook. Marc holds a Bachelor of Science in Business Logistics from Pennsylvania State University. Hey, Marc, welcome to our podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's really great to have you. Before we get going into talking logistics, if you will, Marc, could you please just give us a brief overview of AlixPartners, just in terms of who your basic customers are, the verticals you focus in on, how do you guys really help your clients, basically?
Absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity. So Jay Alex founded the firm back in '81 as just one individual, and since then we've grown to be over 3,000 professionals on a global basis. And as you mentioned before, we are absolutely a business advisory consulting firm. But I think I'll just kind of mention our tagline. Currently is when it really matters.
Okay.
And I think that's really when clients hire us, when they have something with their business that's very important. They want outside help from experts to help them actually deliver an outcome, not just get advice. They come to AlixPartners. And as you mentioned, my current role is supporting clients with all things related to supply chain. We also cover all the other functional areas and in industries that a company could fall into or have needs within. And with that, I'll just kind of leave AlixPartners and the firm behind us so we can get into the details of what's going on in the logistics industry right now. And it's, I would say pretty exciting times. A lot's going on right now.
No question about it. That is sure. And Marc, the last time we spoke, I believe, was in late July, right around not long after Alix had issued its 2024 Consumer and Executive Home Delivery Survey, which was on the website, which was featured in Logistics Management's online news section. And I was curious, Marc. I mean, there are so many takeaways there. You guys surveyed more than 1,100 U.S. consumers aged 18 or above, and also 110 North American-based transportation, logistics, and supply chain executives at companies with more than 100 million in annual revenue. So a really varied sampling or methodology, if you will. And without getting in me telling everyone what the survey was about, I guess one big thesis was that more often than not, what the consumer wants, especially when it comes to online ordering, the consumer tends to get, or the consumer will find another option. So, I mean, that's obviously a very top level overview, but why don't you tell us a little bit about the survey, what you thought was notable in this year's edition, and then we can drill down from there.
Absolutely, and thank you. To me, I think one of the most interesting things about the survey is that we launched it initially being consumer only back in 2012. So we've got over a decade of data points on many of the key questions that we ask each year. But more importantly, a lot of this has occurred as e-commerce and consumers' desire for purchasing their goods online and have it delivered at home has exponentially grown. So we've seen that in the survey. The last couple of years, we've also included the executive survey, and why that's interesting is because we kind of see both sides of the coin here. And I got to tell you, for some of the same topics, there's not alignment between what the consumers want and what the executives of companies serving them are prepared to offer or want to offer even.
Mm-hmm.
But the main point I'd like to hit on is, over the last couple of years, we've seen the acceptable time to get your delivery from your e-commerce purchase drop from 5.5 to down to 3.5. And so effectively, consumers are saying, if I order something online and I get free shipping, I expect to get it in about 3 days.
Sure.
And it's a reasonable expectation. I think in some markets and from some online retailers, you may even experience a faster delivery, but on average, it's around 3. And when you think backwards of what does it take to get it there in 3 days, that's a typical national 4 to 5 warehouse operation if you're using ground freight to hit most of your consumers. And as you said, the vast majority say that getting the free shipping impacts their purchase decision prior to even making the purchase. So you got to offer free or they shop elsewhere. The other main point that you touched on, I think, is very critical, and that's if when the customer is shopping, they don't get the solution that they want. It could be the specific product, whether the time in which they're going to get it, they need it in 3 days or they need it in 2 days, and they can't get it that fast. A quarter of customers shop elsewhere, and that's with another retailer. And so that's a big deal because that's lost sales. In addition to that, this was surprising to me. Consumers would rather have the fast free shipping than time definite or day definite deliveries. And for me, I personally like that convenience of knowing it's going to be delivered on a Thursday or a Friday, even if that means it's 4 or 5 days. 80% of our consumers said, no, we'd rather just have it fast. I want it as soon as you can get it to me. And again, I want it free. Another point that I'll bring up that I thought was pretty interesting is really the intersection of what executives are saying they're able to offer. And so 50% of the executives, after seeing the results of our surveys for many years, said, we aren't going to offer 3-day shipping for free. We can't. We don't, it would have to be air freight to do that based on our network. And so that's a concern. So half the executives we surveyed, and granted, some of them are from, medium and smaller size companies, can't meet the service expectation. And the consumer's telling you, well, if you can't meet my service expectation, I'm going to shop elsewhere. To us, that's a pretty important finding and, a potential area of risk for their business. And then the last thing I'll mention, I think is pretty interesting as well, is that when you have an expectation of getting a delivery in 2 days or 3 days or 4 days or whatever was promised when you made the purchase, and that doesn't happen for whatever reason. It was delayed in transit. It was delayed at the warehouse. Perhaps it wasn't even in stock in the first place, and there was a data issue. Consumers expect some reasonable compensation. Reasonable is something like, hey, I could return the late item with no cost to me. I may get a discount on the shipping, that was late. I may get free shipping on my next order, even if I don't meet the threshold, or some type of nominal compensation, like a $5 credit or something to that effect. And I think these are pretty reasonable. The vast majority of the executives that we surveyed said that they would send an email notifying you that your order is delivered or is going to be delivered late, and that's the only compensation you're going to get. Okay. And so I make a joke that it feels like the scene from Caddyshack when Judge Smeals is talking to his grandson, and the grandson wants a hot dog and a candy bar and a soda and a hamburger, and he says, you'll get nothing and like it.
Exactly.
And I think that's what our executives are saying when it comes to late deliveries. Even though we make the promise, we're relying, for the most part, the vast majority of retailers are relying on third parties to deliver their packages for them. And there's a variety of reasons why they may be late. But at this point, it's pretty much you're going to get information, you're going to get good tracking, but you're not going to get a significant, discount or compensation for that. And to us, that was one of the biggest disconnects we saw from the survey between what the consumer expects and what the company is able or willing to deliver.
Sure. Yeah, no, understood. That's a great overview. Thank you. Let's shift gears. It's somewhat separate but related as we move on here, just in the sense that uh uh, when we talk about peak season, it's taken on a lot of different meanings, especially going back to the onset of the pandemic, when we were all stuck at home, ordering stuff online, focused on home renovations, things like that, different types of projects. It seemed like there was a lot of cash built up on the sidelines, and it felt like peak all the time.
Yeah.
Now we fast forward 4 years later. There's a bit more of a normal cadence, but obviously there's a lot of wild cards too. There was a lot of front loading, and we'll jump into this in a minute. But obviously there's a lot of uncertainty now that we're less than a week to go, with a new deal still not reached for East and Gulf Coast ports with their union. We'll jump into that more in a moment. But the threat of tariffs or increased tariffs, there's a lot of different things that sort of are hanging over this year's peak season, Mark. But putting those things to the side, and we'll jump into the port situation again in a minute. How do you feel about the 2024 peak, especially relative to recent years? And you can talk about ocean, you could talk about it from a parcel perspective, whatever you like, but just how are you seeing things?
I mean, my first response was going to be peak. What peak? This has been spread out over a long period of time for a variety of reasons. I'll tell you that some of the early summer or midsummer shopping deals and special, discount days that happen has spread out some volume from some purchases. I think you're absolutely right, though, about the risk of this East Coast port strike, and shippers taking it seriously. I personally, at the beginning of this year, when there was started to hear some noise about it, thought, well, there's always noise, and usually it works out. But then it just didn't seem to progress in terms of a good outcome where there's not going to be a stoppage. And so many companies, not just retailers, but industrials as well, started to place orders early, right? And they
Mhm.
started to change some of their routing as well, which translated to perhaps a little bit more West Coast volume or volume going through a Canadian port than perhaps you would have seen if there was no threat of an East Gulf Coast, work stoppage.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is, like, listen, if you look at just volumes, yes, there's always seasonality, and that our consumer economy is driven off of the holiday season, and the old Black Friday of retailers actually turning a profit for the year, and that's sort of the timing of it. So of course we're going to still have that phenomenon. But to me, the issue with peak is when you've got more demand than supply at a period of time. And right now, if you're in the logistics industry, it's quite the opposite. We
Yes.
wish there was more demand, and there's plenty of supply. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But that's making this year's peak a lot more muted. There's still some, import ocean locations that are dealing with a short term over a couple of weeks container shortage, and that drives spot rates up a little bit and perhaps a little bit of delays. But we're not seeing anything like we did during the COVID years, that's for sure. And I think some of the shippers out there took the threats of the risks seriously and started smoothing out peak even more this year. So that's why I don't feel like this is such a tough year, at least for now,
Mhm.
in terms of dealing with peak.
Okay, that's great. That's a great overview. And just back to the East and Gulf Coast ports. I mean, as the days go on, Mark, especially in recent weeks, you're seeing the water kind of boil more, if you will.
Yeah.
Pardon the poor pun there. I mean, there's been letters sent to the White House, whether they're from the NRF, National Retail Federation, that
Yeah.
is, and a host of other organizations as well, calling for whether it's calling for the White House to intervene and get the parties to a table to hammer out a deal, or calling on the parties themselves. And of course, the ongoing saber rattling, if you will, between the ILA and USMX. a while back it was thought, hey, it's June or it's August, a deal will get done. But now we're
Right.
literally less than a week out, and it's looking fairly bleak, to say the least. How do you size this up, and what do you think happens from a supply chain slash operations perspective if we get to a week from today, which is in fact October 1st, and the ports are closed?
Yeah. So listen, I think in the short term, this is a real risk. And that, like I mentioned before, I think many shippers have been taking it seriously and taking actions, the only actions that they could up to this point. I also think that in a situation like this, you have to think about all the different constituents and what they're trying to get out of it, right? And there was a major contract renegotiation recently with the West Coast, which
Yeah.
ended up in, I think ending with some higher increases in wages for workers, part of, that union. And when the last article that I read about sort of the offer for wage increases over the next couple of years and the positioning from the union on, where they'd like to see that offer be, it's a pretty big difference. They're off by, double, right? It's I think
Yeah.
they're asking for double what the most recent offer. Can that be closed? Can that gap be closed? Of course it can. But in order to close a gap that big, I think there needs to be a little bit more pressure. Sometimes that pressure comes in the form of waiting to the very last minute. We're kind of seeing that happen now. Some of that pressure could come from actually having a stoppage for a period of time. That period of time could be a couple of hours, it could be a couple of days.
Hmm.
I don't think most people believe it's going to be a couple of weeks or months, because I think there's so many different stakeholders here that would be harmed by that there could be some type of arrangement worked out. My understanding is the last time that something this large has occurred, where it would be multi-coast, goes back into, the mid to late 70s, when, a entire Gulf Coast and East Coast would be, kind of paralyzed with something like this. So to me, I feel like we're going to be going up right to the 11th hour, right to, the 30th, and perhaps even on the first. See,
Hmm.
that stuff. The one thing I will mention, though, that the customers are being considered. There's overtime being worked today. There's talks about weekend hours and all kinds of extended extra hours to try to get cargo that's currently, on the terminals off into, a drayage provider or some kind of, lot, to allow things to continue to move somewhat. So I think there's some preparations being made that even if there is a stoppage, perhaps it won't be as bad as if there was no planning at all.
Sure. Yeah. Well, that's certainly a good thing. And you had said the mid to late 70s. I think I read this morning that it was in fact 1977. So
Mhm.
what a long time ago, to be
Yeah.
sure. A few moments back, Mark, you had talked about sort of the lack of demand out there, which is obviously been a driver for sort of depressed volumes and things like that. We did see finally the Federal Reserve announced its interest rate cut last week to the tune of a half a point.
Yeah.
Um, in your opinion, what does that mean for our markets? Does that represent perhaps a sign of increased demand coming down the road, or is it kind of a more of a slow but steady, let's see where this goes and where it gets us kind of approach?
Yeah, I wish I had a more eloquent way to put it, but I think it really is a mixed bag. The fact that it was a 50 basis point cut and not a quarter of a point cut, to me signals that there's some concern by the Fed about the health of the economy.
Hmm.
And, granted, also they have a little bit more confidence inflation coming down, but it's still not at two, right? I think it was like 2.5 or something to that effect,
Yes.
and trending in the right direction. But there's some concern the economy is slowing. And so to me, that's sort of the first thing. Slowing economy doesn't give me confidence that there's going to be increased, and certainly not outsized demand for consumption of goods and for the transportation, that's required to get it there.
Hmm.
So that's the first thing. To me, that's a little bit of a, negative sign. However, if you're a consumer, this does help, right? If you've got variable interest rates, you'll start to see less of an interest expense. If you're a logistics company, and you have equipment that you finance, which is most companies out there
Oh,
that provide
absolutely.
those services, you could see some relief. And same thing with just general corporate debt that's variable. This is a help to reduce some of those interest expenses that you're facing. So that's I think a positive. Here's sort of a negative to consider. What this market really needs is more demand, and we're going to get what we get. But the solution to the problem is unfortunately that some of the capacity has to come out to create that balance, and it hasn't. And frankly, reducing interest rates and taking away some of the burden for companies that are sort of on the edge of perhaps not being able to operate, perhaps lengthens the amount of time for that capacity to come out. And so that's why I think it's really a mixed bag. And that in the short term, we're probably not going to see a whole lot of change, right? It just happened. It takes some time for these things to actually start having an effect. But if we continue to see the Fed aggressively acting, and I think the latest positioning or messaging that they put out there is two more 25 basis point cuts, that may actually, spur a little bit of enthusiasm in the economy to buy more, and it may help some of those marginal companies, which keeps capacity in there. And again, we go back to my mixed bag analogy. I think that's sort of where we're going to be, but nothing major in the short term though with that, at least that I've seen and from those I've talked to.
Okay, that's a great analysis there. And you had just talked about depressed, or I'm sorry, excess capacity. And
Yeah.
obviously, when we look at the truckload market, excess capacity is and remains a major driver impacting the rate environment.
Yeah.
With rates still low, to be sure. Now that's just the trucking part, but what is your take sort of on the pricing environment as we look at certain modes? And why don't we for now just stick with trucking and on the water, Mark?
Sure. So with trucking, there's really two ways to think about pricing. The first would be the contract pricing, and I'm talking about one way for hire trucking, not where you have a dedicated fleet with fixed routes and stuff like that. But the bulk of the freight that's moving on one way for hire pricing, we're seeing through this RFP season and through the process with our clients this year that the rates are kind of flattish, if that's a word. And they're low. They're too low for the likes of the trucking companies, but the amount of volume that moves through those contract rates is significant. And a lot of the companies that provide those services don't want to lose that volume with that customer, perhaps a customer that's somewhat reliable with steady freight. And so on the contract rates, we're really not seeing much movement. It's kind of bouncing along the bottom, so to speak, for a visual. The
Yeah.
spot market, though, has become a little bit more volatile. And so I think that certainly the favors carriers that ship with small, shippers, right? They have customers that are smaller that maybe don't have the buying power or the sophistication to put, contracts into place. And, we've seen that. And I think with any kind of spike in volume over this kind of muted peak, you'll see that happening through the spot market. I think we're going to be into next year before we really start to see contract rates materially improve. I would be pretty surprised if contract rates materially go down from where we are now. I feel like we've reached a point of stability for a long enough time that this is sort of effectively the floor for now.
Yeah.
On the ocean rates, it's a similar situation where the contract rates are a lot lower than they were certainly during the COVID years. I would say that they're perhaps a little bit healthier for ocean carriers for some of these trades where they're continuing to work with the same large customer. But the spot market has been pretty volatile, and some of that has been based on equipment availability and other sort of spikes in demand out of a certain port going in a certain trade, either to West Coast US or to Western Europe.
Yeah.
And that's again, a very similar phenomenon where if you're not having a relationship, it can even be with an NVOCC, but if you don't have contract rates you're really seeing some volatility in your ocean freight, especially from the major trades where products flow from Asia to the U.S. and or North America and Asia to Western Europe.
Got it. Okay, that's great. And just one more quick one before we wrap up here, Mark, and that simply would just be the topic of tariffs. They've been in the news a lot, especially of late. Um, some organizations, and I'll cite the NRF, National Retail Federation again, who have really come out and expressed their disdain for tariffs and increased tariffs in some cases, calling it an increased cost of doing business for the actual businesses themselves and obviously for consumers. How do you guys sort of gauge or view what's going on tariff wise and what could be in store?
Well, if you look over the last several years, the tariffs that have been put in place that impact imports into the North American market, and some of them are, U.S. specific. Some of them cut across, the North American, treaty with Mexico and the U.S. Most specifically, the one that's happened very recently on metals, on steel and aluminum, and some other chemicals being imported from China, where tariffs have gone from a range of 0 to 7.5% up to 25%, and that's enough that companies that are importing those goods are starting to make purchase decisions from other regions and actually impacting trade flow. Now, in that situation, it impacts Mexico as well, so there's not that nearshoring option. But there's also for at least for steel and aluminum, I don't know if there's enough capacity in other places to support the North American demand for that. And so this is somewhat disruptive, and we're seeing that happen. The other point I'd bring up, which is a pretty interesting one, is related to importation of low value goods, the old de minimis less than 800 per package rule. And there's been a lot of talk about significantly changing the application of that ruling, and perhaps have an impact on how cost effective that is to do. And I don't know, there's been talk about it. The U.S. government has gotten involved a little bit over the summer and put a halt to some of those shipments for, I think, a couple days or a week or something. And this is one where it's top of mind, I think, for retailers, because that's a pretty competitive offering. Yes, it takes more than the 3 days I talked about in the home delivery survey, but at price points that are significantly lower than something you can get that's already here in the U.S., then people are willing to wait for, I guess you would call it, significant value, and I'm doing air quotes with the value there. That's one where I'm watching it very closely, because there's two major importers, Shein and Temu, that have really grown that business, and logistics companies that support them have seen a pretty big increase in volumes from those two entities based on that ruling. If that ruling were to change, it would be a major shakeup, not only for consumers that have started to become accustomed to buying these low value goods and getting them relatively quickly, even though they're coming across the Pacific. And then obviously those logistics companies would see that volume perhaps change, in a negative way.
No, absolutely. All right, Mark. Well, this brings us to the end of our allotted time for today's podcast recording. So on behalf of Logistics Management Magazine and also the Peerless Media Supply Chain Group, I'd like to say thanks for joining us and spending some time with us today.
Thank you, Jeff. It was my pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Really great to have you. And for those of you out there that would like to learn a bit more about AlixPartners, they are on LinkedIn. It's linkedin.com/company/AlixPartners / and that's ALIX Partners, all one word. Mark is also on LinkedIn. So if you want to give him a shout, it's just search on LinkedIn and look for him. And his first name is spelled MarcIampieri for the last name. And also give us a follow on Twitter if you'd like to. That's simply @LogisticsMT. And also, please go ahead and follow us if you're not already. Just look for Supply Chain 24/7 wherever you get your podcast. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you next time.